Hey everyone, I'm super excited to be sitting down with Andy Boyd. He's the recent head of the CIA Center for Cyber Intelligence. This is a guy who has briefed the US cabinet on cyber threats to the most powerful country in the world and how they can respond. I want to know what keeps him up at night, what we should be worried about, and what intelligence is being kept from us. For news junkies like me out there, we're going to go deep on cyber, less so on traditional warfare like what we're seeing in Iran and Israel. It should be an amazing conversation. Let's jump in. Andy, thanks so much for being here today. I really appreciate it. You are the former director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence at the CIA. Maybe just to start off, can you give us a flavor of what the Center for Cyber Intelligence does at the CIA?
Good morning. Thanks, Jeff, for having me on the podcast. This is a really exciting opportunity. Yeah, so I retired from CIA back in October 2023. And for the 4 preceding years, I was, as you noted, the director for the Center for Cyber Intelligence. And so what I've said publicly about this before, there are obviously some limitations to the level of detail I can get into, but the Center for Cyber Intelligence is what we would call the mission manager for all things cyber at CIA. That means offensive cyber, strategic analysis, and all the technology, tools, engineering that goes into both of those disciplines. At the end of the day, CIA is an intelligence collection enterprise and an intelligence analytical enterprise. And so the Center for Cyber Intelligence produced all the strategic intelligence for the president on down in the U.S. government on nation-state and non-nation state cyber threats, how they related to the U.S. government, and how it related to threats against our economy, our private sector, and whatnot. But in addition to that, we were responsible for using our tools to collect intelligence across a whole array of disciplines, be it counterterrorism to near peer nation state competition. And it was a great honor to lead that workforce, a highly skilled workforce for the 4 years I was in that job. So.
It's super interesting, and obviously so important. You mentioned offensive cyber capabilities. In the analysis side, was there a role to play defensively as well in sharing intelligence that could be used to help organizations, either public or within the U.S. commercial, to defend against potential bad actors, or was it purely more on the offensive side?
No. So, I mean, and this is an interesting point, because there's tactical intelligence, and I mean that from a small I, not necessarily just government intelligence. And then there's strategic intelligence. And what the CIA does is more at the strategic level. When I was getting out of retiring from the government, I got a lot of calls from folks asking if I was interested in various CISO jobs. And I said, I am not qualified to be a CISO. I am not a network defender. And I never have been. But what our strategic analysis looked at is to give the context as to what the cyber threats were, principally from nation states, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, but also ransomware actors, other criminal actors, a whole variety of hacking schemes, and wrote it at a level for executives really to make decisions on to how to defend the country. I mean, why is China hacking the Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon situations? Why were the Russians doing what they were doing with their cyber tools? It was useful for context for the average CISO, even U.S. government CISOs, to use to understand the context, but it wasn't going to tell them how to defend their network. That's a different type of intelligence.
Right. And did you find, so I mean, you sort of had a front row seat to being able to understand exactly the threat levels that we could expect here. Did you find that most, kind of organizational leaders, whether they're, I'm thinking largely outside the government, but inside the government too, were they able to properly assess the threat level, or did you find they were underestimating it?
It depends. I mean, there's certain industry, the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, which does all the cyber defense and critical infrastructure defense, identifies.
Yeah, they better know.
Yeah, well, they identify 16. Oh, and they do, but they identify 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And certain sectors are extraordinarily good at cyber defense. The financial sector really understands it, because it's a no-fail mission for them. If a nation state or non-nation state actor hacks into a major banking system. I mean, we're all going to be hurt by that. But they also, because they're banks, they have the financial resources to have good cyber defense. Go all the way down the spectrum, and there are certain critical infrastructure sectors that don't have good cyber defense, and it's not necessarily their fault. They sometimes didn't even really consider themselves part of a digital landscape. For instance, water treatment plants, wastewater treatment, and so they were victims from nation state actors, from ransomware actors over the past few years. And so CISA and others have begun to really focus on that. So I think it varies from industry to industry. And I do think the US government, the private sector is coalescing around a way to defend those critical infrastructures, but it's going to vary from industry to industry, frankly.
So when you were leading the center, what kept you up at night, and what keeps you up at night these days, and how has the, kind of cyber threat landscape changed in that time?
I've never slept better since October 2023.
I'm happy to hear
uh,
that.
yeah.
Maybe.
What kept me up? I spent the bulk of my CIA career serving in the Middle East. I'm Arabic speaker. I did a lot of work in the counterterrorism space, as most of my generation did after 9/11. That stuff kept me up at night, because of the mission, but also worrying about what it all meant. So as the leader for the Center for Cyber Intelligence, I had less sleepless nights, but it was more of a longer burn than counterterrorism. It's thinking about, do we have the manpower? Do we have the infrastructure? Do we have the relationship between the government and the private sector to really defend against what I think is an existential threat? It's not the kind of threat that takes down the World Trade Center. It's not the kind of threat that results in an airplane crashing into the Pentagon. That's a very visible threat, but it's as much an existential threat with a longer burn time. I'll cite one private sector example that is not necessarily a nation state. Ransomware actors, which frequently have a dotted line relationship, particularly in Russia, with state actors. But there was a ransomware attack against United Healthcare this past year, and a subsidiary of United Healthcare called Change Healthcare, which essentially manages all the pharmacy distribution, CVS, Walgreens in the United States, at least. I don't know about Canada, but it may be part of the same system, but I'm not sure. That ransomware attack, the ransomware attackers asked for $22 million in ransomware, which was paid. What frequently gets overlooked is that the overall cost and loss in revenue to United Healthcare was north of $1.6 billion. And I think it's still growing. And you multiply that, and that's just one company. Now, granted, a very large company, but still just one company in one of those critical infrastructure sectors. You multiply that across multiple industries, and there's billions and billions of dollars at stake every single day due to cyber threats, due to data theft, intellectual property theft, ransomware attacks, et cetera. So it is an existential threat. So in the aggregate, all of that stuff kept me up at night. But I'm sleeping better now.
I'm happy to hear that. And I mean, even in the conversation so far, there's everything from, existential threats to organizations financially to, attacks on critical infrastructure. If you were advising, and I think in some cases you are, organizational leaders, what type of actors would you want them to be most concerned about? Is it nation states? Is it, organized crime? Is it one-offs? You mentioned kind of nation state adjacent actors. And what are the implications of some of the, some of the threats there?
So I think, even in the very advanced folks like in the financial services industries who have, very strong personnel working on cybersecurity, even they admit that they need to engage with the U.S. government, be it with DHS, CISA, be it with entities at Treasury or whoever their, as we like to call it, sector-specific relationship with the federal government is, because they don't know everything and they need to know the strategic context. And they need to understand why possibly a state actor would want to attack, a certain network and whatnot. For example, in February 2022, the Russians invaded Ukraine. We, in that, and I was still in the government then, we went through different decisions, at the policy level on what level of support we were going to provide to the Ukrainians. And we had many discussions in policy circles as to what that may trigger as far as cyber attacks, other attacks, but my focus obviously was cyber attacks from the Russians. And what I found is a lot of the critical infrastructure leaders in the private sector wanted to understand, okay, what's coming down the pike and what should we be prepared for potentially from the Russians? It turns out that there wasn't much coming from the Russian side against U.S. networks, financial institutions, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that was unknowable in February 2022, and we had to be prepared. And so what was interesting to me is some of the most highly skilled cyber defenders in those critical infrastructure sectors still wanted to understand, what the threat was from Russia. I think the same context we now, again, I made reference to Volt Typhoon, which is essentially is the People's Republic of China pre-positioning tools on critical infrastructure in the event that there is a potentially a cross Taiwan Strait conflict between the United States and China. Volt Typhoon, and then Salt Typhoon, which was, again, some entity within the Chinese government, I suspect their intelligence agency, putting tools down on our telecommunications infrastructure in the United States and using it to collect information against senior U.S. government leaders and others. I think the conversation has shifted away, at least for now, from what the Russians are doing, because that's just, it was sort of a nothing burger for the United States, at least, to something that is not a nothing burger, the Chinese threat, both from an intelligence collection perspective and a critical infrastructure protection perspective. And having those industry leaders, telecommunications leaders, be cognizant of that threat, potentially even at a classified government information level, I think is critical. All those conversations are happening, maybe not on a daily basis, but at least on a weekly basis. So.
Right. And so, if you had the magic power to be kind of everywhere at once across the, I guess the defend surface, so to speak, across governments and organizations, and let me say first, like, my goal here is not to expose national weaknesses, but like, where do you think, like, where would you be most concerned about shoring up, our ability to defend ourselves against some of these attacks?
I mean, I think most immediately, and this has been talked about in the press quite a bit, I think we have to reset where we are in the telecommunications infrastructure, because that undergirds, everything that we do. Luckily, I mean, knowing that is the threat and it's there is important, but it's going to, the telecommunications infrastructure in the United States is sort of a balkanized infrastructure that was cobbled together from what used to be AT&T. And then it became what we call in the U.S. the baby bells back in the 80s. And so as a result, it's not a particularly logical infrastructure, and that has to be changed because, the barn door was wide open, and that's how the Chinese got in. So that, I would love to see that, be a major focus in 2025 for infrastructure security. But, there's a lot of other things as well. I mean, how we, it's something that's evolved over the past 2 years, the advent of chat GPT and the advances that we have in AI technology. I worry deeply that our intellectual property is getting stolen at a rate that it's almost too late to close the barn door. And we have to develop the defensive techniques against our algorithms, our way of defending our intellectual property in AI, and then legislation and then policy that helps us do that. That is my next major concern. As far as the other critical infrastructure sector, gas and oil transportation, electric distribution, water distribution, wastewater treatment, healthcare, education, all those are critical infrastructure sectors. We have to address those as well. But honestly, we don't have enough bandwidth in the U.S. government or the private sector to do them all at once. But we'll get there.
Yeah. You mentioned policy, and I'm curious from a defensive posture perspective, like, what is the role of policy versus, technological defense versus, defense in terms of, like, human user training and defending from that perspective? And I'm sure that there's a few other dimensions as well, but Is it all three? Where do we get the most bang for our buck?
I mean, it is all three, and I'll just reference. I was last week was the RSA, the leading cybersecurity conference in San Francisco every year, and there was 60,000 attendees, private sector, global private sector representation, but also international government, and the current administration was very well represented there, from the Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem on down, military figures, intelligence community figures. And there's obviously very significant differences in policy and human resources practices between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. But what struck me was the seriousness with which the current representatives last week from the administration are thinking about cybersecurity, akin to what the previous team in the Biden administration did. So cybersecurity is a bipartisan issue, and policy is part of that. And I'll cite one point that Kristi Noem's deputy talked about at a forum I attended. There's a policy started under the Biden administration called Secure by Design, wherein software developers don't beta test their software on their customers. They actually design it with security in mind and user experience and functionality and whatnot. I had thought that was going to change significantly with this current administration, and there may be tweaks on it as far as how they address the private sector. But in general, it would appear that the new administration supports Secure by Design, and it's going to set policy parameters in collaboration with Congress on legislation to mandate that private sector software development is done with security as a default in mind, which I think is critically important. So the private sector, how they develop software and deal with infrastructure, policy from the White House, the executive branch in the government, and legislation from Congress are all critical in my mind. Three legs of the stool, so to speak.
Right. So you mentioned Secure by Design, and to me that's that's an arrow in the quiver, let's say, of what an organization can do to remain secure. When you're advising CISOs or senior security leaders at different organizations, if they're asking, like, where do I start with this? How do I what tactics can I put into place to make sure that we're secure? Do you have some stock answers for the best starting points that are gonna have the most outsized impact?
It really depends on the size of the company. Like a major bank with tens of thousands of employees can buy an enormous amount of products to deal with external threats, deal with insider threats, deal with vulnerabilities on their own networks and whatnot, down to companies of a dozen people or less. And it's more the small companies that are an issue, I think, and they have to really lean on CISA, try to get help from the government where they're going to have to really track or outsource to us, because some companies are too small to even have a CISO or even an IT provider. So they have to be careful who they bring in to manage that sort of stuff, because there's certain small companies that frankly are as important as the big companies. That company that makes some certain widget for U.S. Air Force fighter aircraft, if their networks are compromised by a state actor that wants to understand how those jet engines or whatever are assembled, they're equally at risk as the Lockheed Martins of the world are. Yet the Lockheed Martins of the world are going to be able to buy every tool that you can imagine. So a lot of those discussions happen at RSA. A lot of people focused on, like, how do we detect those external threats? But there are an enormous number of products out there for what we would call attack surface management, and looking inside at your own inventory. The bring your own device epoch that we live in makes defending networks even more difficult, because not everybody is going to be as wise as to how to secure your own endpoints. So it's a very big job for CISOs or the security providers for those small companies. But what is great now is 10 years ago nobody was really focused on any of that, both at the U.S. government level and the private sector level, we're having a very open conversation, as evidenced last week at RSA. So I do think we're heading in the correct direction to ensure that those existential threats are minimized to the greatest extent possible.
So thinking about those like small and mid-sized organizations, I mean, I agree with you. I feel like that is the biggest risk, and it's the long tail of risk there. If if the board of one of those companies brought you in and said, Andy, how exposed are we? Do you have sort of like a questionnaire in your mind, or, a quick cheat sheet for how you would assess their exposure level to threats?
I don't have a cheat because again, every company is going to be different, but I have addressed various boards of directors on that particular issue, and I'm on 3 boards myself, so I'm constantly worried about that as it relates to the companies that I'm involved with. Um, but I what I say is, if you're a company that's big enough to have a CISO or a chief security officer, I mean, really two things is identity management and ensuring that you don't have people pretending to be other people on your, in your organization, and then access control. If you manage those two things, um, pretty much everything else, takes care of itself. The third thing, and this is, basically since the dawn of hacking in the 80s, um, teach your employees about phishing and social engineering, and do not click on that link if you don't know who it's from. I mean, it sounds like, well, yeah, of course not. Like in 2025, nobody would do that. But the overwhelming majority of ransomware attacks in particular, but also state actor hacking, is via spear phishing. And with the advent of AI tools, Chat GPT and the other ones, it makes it a lot easier because previously the emails would be written in gibberish. It'd be like, okay, this is obviously some guy from you know wherever in the planet trying to hack my computer. Click on this, and we'll give you $200,000 or whatever. Um, now because of AI tools, you can have idiomatically correct American English, and it can sound like it's coming from your boss. So it's a very difficult thing to do. There are identity management tools that are much more advanced than they were several years ago. But really, I mean, that is what I would say to a board: is identity management and access control, and ensure that people who don't need access to certain SharePoint devices or whatnot don't have that access.
Yeah. No, it makes sense, and I think that's very much in line with what I've heard from security analysts around here anyway. But you brought up AI, and you brought it up a little bit earlier, and I want to talk about that for a minute. How, in your mind, is AI changing the threat landscape these days? I mean, I'll ask that in two ways. How is it changing it from the bad actor perspective? How is it changing it from our ability to defend? And net, what does that mean?
So I think it like a lot of advances in technology, both the attackers and the defenders sort of go down that field together, and maybe not at the exact same pace, but so again, the social engineering aspect of ransomware is a lot easier with AI tools. Um, Also, someone who really has no vulnerability research or exploit development skills can use AI tools to frankly just build exploits and send them down the pipe with really no training or experience in that as well. And you know, they're not going to be able to build 0 days off of AI tools per se, but there's a lot of, the top 10 vulnerabilities on endpoints are all end days and have been out there and unpatched for a very long time. AI tools are going to help bad actors deal with that. That being said, AI tools in the SOC in a company's security operations center are advancing at a rate that I never would have predicted 2 years ago that they would have been, and automating the ability to see what the threat landscape is out there, automating the ability to look inside your network and watch changes on endpoints and actors that are doing things that are outside the normal. The average human is not going to be able to detect those abnormalities and shut them down. So, I mean, I think, over time, frankly, over the next year or two, I think a lot of those security operations center tools are going to be completely driven by AI. Other AI tools and folks that I saw out at RSA and were at RSA last year using those AI tools to detect deep fakes, to detect audio fakes, a lot of audio fakes. I mean, a number of your viewers and listeners may have been getting random spam calls on their phones. Don't ever answer them, because what we think people are doing is trying to get a voice cut from you and then use
Wow.
that
Wow.
for audio deep fakes to use, like if you use uh, an audio or a voice imprint for getting access to your bank account or whatever. I think a lot of the banks are moving away from that, thank God, and using different forms of MFA. Um, but all of those tools are being developed, video, like detection tools for video deep fakes. I mean, a friend of mine has developed an audio deepfake tool, which you may remember from the election when President Biden was still in the race. Somebody made a deepfake of his voice telling people not to go to the polls in New Hampshire during the New Hampshire primary. It sounded exactly like him. This guy's tool was able to detect that that's not actually President Biden. And those sort of, and that's a very, famous example, but that sort of stuff at a much lower level happens on almost on a daily basis. So I'm very confident where we are as defenders, on both sides of that AI equation, but also from just a how we build software in general. I think a lot of the writing of software is going to be done using AI tools, leaving the human to work on more advanced things or enhancing the user experience in whatever the software tool is. And so, there's been a lot of talk, oh, it's going to replace, people shouldn't go to get computer science degrees anymore because you're going to be replaced. And, why learn how to code when AI is going to do it? You still have to learn how to code if you're going to be in that industry. It's just going to make your job a lot easier, and you can work on other things, and you can, quality check as opposed to, writing the basics of software development. So I think in the aggregate, AI tools are going to be great for the cybersecurity industry.
That's great. And yeah, I tend to agree on the coding side. And what I think about too is it's like engineering didn't, as a field, didn't disappear when the advent of the calculator came along, right? Or the computer.
Right.
It's it automates some of the some of the more operational stuff. But yeah, fair enough. I did want to ask you though, Andy, whether it's AI related or not, and I'll let you use your own discretion in answering this, but can you tell us maybe a little bit about any cyber attacks or capabilities that you uncovered that surprised you with their sophistication or even their innovation?
Yeah, I don't know if it's innovation per se. It's the brazenness of it, maybe. And I'll go back to the Vault Typhoon, Salt Typhoon. I mean, a number of experts have discussed this in the press, so it's not particularly sensitive, but I mean, it's sensitive to the industries, but not from an intelligence perspective. The Vault Typhoon prepositioning of tools was executed using what we call living off the land techniques. So it wasn't some very sophisticated zero-day exploit. It was essentially looking for those vulnerabilities and using what is already existing out there as far as tools go, so that the very aspect or the very act of living off the land of using NDAs or tools that you can find on the dark web, you really don't look like a major nation state actor. And so it took a long time for us, both in the private sector and the government, to detect that. And that was pretty gutsy on the the People's Republic of China government. We think the military cyber entities pre-positioning tools and infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific, pre-positioning tools on infrastructure in the United States, but just being very hard to detect because it doesn't look like nation state actors. So that surprised me in that sense. What also surprised me, another Chinese attack, the Salt Typhoon attack, was that they really studied the target, and again, it wasn't a sophisticated zero-day per se, but they studied the vulnerabilities and built what they needed to get in those networks, and it was essentially, not unlike the Ball Typhoon, exploiting our own weaknesses. So it's taken a change in how we analyze the threat. Previously, it was like, okay, sophisticated actors, 0 days, they're really gonna build something that is just so innovative and we hadn't seen before. And it's actually really the opposite now. It's using our own vulnerabilities and exploiting those, which did surprise me that that technique is being used. So we just have to be much more cognizant of that and be more cognizant of our own weaknesses. Just like if you're the CISO at a medium-sized company, it's important to know what the threat is externally, but you have to deeply understand your own vulnerabilities, your own endpoints, your own network vulnerabilities, or what's on the outside is going to have a much easier, uh, job getting on the inside.
When you talk about vulnerabilities and weaknesses, can you add a little bit of color to that? What types of vulnerabilities are we talking about here?
Unpatched endpoints. I mean, it at the end of the day, uh, ransomware actors, you know, foreign intelligence organizations, or entities that want to conduct disruptive or destructive offensive cyber attacks, they want to land on an endpoint, and if the endpoint is a desktop, a laptop, a phone, those where the vulnerabilities are. So, for all of your viewers and listeners, update your software on your endpoint. If you're an Apple user, update as frequently as possible. If you're an Android user, update as frequently as possible. And the same goes for your desktops and laptops. Now, you know, in 2025, that's fairly easy if you're paying attention. But there's other things on your networks that are patched less frequently. There's, your Wi-Fi routers, your network devices that, unless you're an IT professional or a CISO, you don't really think a whole lot about those. That worries me. Vulnerabilities on those that are, eventually identified by CISA and they get a CVE rating and whatnot. But you really got to be paying attention. You have to be patching those things on a routine basis. The other concern is IoT devices, which are very rarely patched. We now have refrigerators that seem to be like sentient beings in and of themselves, and those are attack vectors if they're on your network, if they're networked in with the rest of your devices. That is a very significant vulnerability, and I do think we focus on IT security, but there's OT security, operational technology, that I really think we need to focus more on, because that is a significant vulnerability. And then finally, I referenced earlier the bring your own device, which sort of dominates most companies now. It's understanding, it's for the CISO and the IT professionals, the CIOs, if a company's big enough to have a CIO, to understand what the threat vector is from those bring your own device situations, and ensuring that you have policies and an ability to check that your employees are actually doing what they're supposed to do and updating software on their own devices.
Right. We've talked mainly about kind of organizational risk, and there we talked a little bit more about device level risk and how you get into the networks. One of the threats I've been hearing more about lately, and I don't know if it's been on your radar, Andy, I imagine it is in some capacity, is I've heard it described as, I think it's called like pig butchering scams, or basically human engineering approaches where you actually build trust over a long period of time, and then you have progressively bigger asks and find ways to exploit people at a level that ends up being millions and millions of dollars. Is that something that's on your radar, and how does that fit into the broader threat landscape?
I mean, it is, and it's especially concerning for vulnerable, populations, older people. I mean, my mother and father are older, and now, granted, I briefed them on that, and so they don't have not yet fallen victim to that. But it happens on a daily basis, and there's entire, particularly in Southeast Asia, it's developed into a thing where there's entire offices or warehouses filled with folks that are working on these schemes. It's not all that different than years ago when the Nigerian prince would call you up and say, "Hey, I just need a loan of $50,000 and I'm going to give you $1 million in return." I mean, it's the same sort of social engineering idea. It's just that it's being done at a scale that it hadn't been done before. That being said, I mean, a lot of foreign governments, even the Chinese government, is very focused on it and is very concerned about it. I mean, there's Chinese nationals that have been lured into working in these, pig butchering farms or whatever we want to call them. But as far as like cyber threats writ large, nation state threats, ransomware threats, I still would not put that in my top 5 of things that I focus on. I do think it's a major threat to vulnerable populations. But as far as existential threats to our livelihoods, I don't really consider it rising to that level.
Makes sense. So going back to that level and to that top 5, if you think about our current, I'll call it exposure and infection, to what degree are you worried? Like we've talked about some of these tools, we've talked about critical infrastructure. Are we already significantly exposed in a way where if some of these nation states, wanted to move to, more of like, I'll call a hot phase of cyber war, they could, push a button and, really cripple cyber infrastructure? Or are we sufficiently defended now and it's about staying defended? Like, where are we in that cycle?
So I'll use a couple of descriptors for that. So I mentioned earlier that I spent much of my career in the counterterrorism space, and immediately after 9/11, there was a number of U.S. government agencies that were kind of doing their own thing. We hadn't really coalesced into a organized entity. We did quite quickly over time. The intelligence community, the special operations community, the law enforcement community, and then all of our foreign partners. To the point where by, I would argue, mid 2002, we had a pretty good, set of tools within the U.S. government and our allies to fight that terrorism fight. I think we're in that continuum right now in 2025, where we're coalescing our government capabilities on the defensive, on the offensive, on the strategic analysis, on the policy, and on the legislation. The major difference between what we're doing today in cyber threats and what we did in counterterrorism is that arguably 90%, maybe even more, 95% of the attack surface is owned by the private sector. That's a big difference. And so what that coalescing is including the private sector. But, for instance, some of the U.S. government leaders that I referenced earlier were part of roundtables with CEOs, CSOs, CISOs at RSA last week. And we were talking collectively about a strategy on how to deal with that, what our weaknesses are, and really, looking at who owns the defensive responsibilities, who owns, the middle road, the active defense of yanking threats off of data centers, other, U.S. owned or, North American networks, and then who owns the offensive side, the actual active offensive side. I argued that offensive cyber operations are really the realm of governments, in theory, under appropriate authorities, delegating to certain private sector companies. But you're not going to have, the telecommunication industry, hacking into the Chinese telecommunications industry in revenge for Salt Typhoon. That's just not the way it's going to work. But it was very useful to have that dialogue. So are we vulnerable? Yes, we are vulnerable. But are we aware of those vulnerabilities as an industry? Yeah. We just have to have the policy and the legislation to support both the defense, the just defending networks, the standard CISO, CSO type activity, the active defense of having the authorities to, if you're a company that owns data centers, actively removing foreign threats once they've been identified either by your own situational awareness or intelligence provided by the government, and then how we go about using offensive tools. In Washington, at least, you hear a lot of people talking about wanting to get more aggressive on offensive cyber. The problem is sometimes they don't define what they mean by that, and so I'm spending quite a bit of time helping people get to a definition of what they mean by that. Because to your point, our is some foreign entity can just push a button and attack our critical infrastructure. It doesn't work that way. There are three components of effective cyber attacks: speed, control, and intensity, and they're all sort of countervailing variables. You can have some really intense cyber attacks, but they're going to be out of control, and then you get sort of a worm that goes globally, breaking everyone's networks. There are certain actors that are happy to do that, but you really can't affect and disrupt and destroy particular targets if you're going to do it that way. So we just, as a government and with our allied partners, really need to come to coalesce around what we mean by offensive cyber, and how that is going to contribute to the defense, or more importantly, as a deterrent to foreign cyber attacks. But all those conversations are going, and that some people think, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones in context of offensive cyber operations. I mean, our foreign adversaries have pretty fragile glass houses as well. So I think we're all in the same, playing field there. So.
The offensive cyber is exactly where I wanted to go. And it's already interesting. You kind of distinguished offensive cyber versus what you called active defensive. Would you consider us in a state of either cold cyber warfare right now with any nation states, or hot cyber warfare? And what do you like? How would you describe our current posture toward, offensive operations there?
No, so I don't think we're in a state of constant cyber warfare. I mean, warfare involves bombs and, guns and death and destruction. And we've never seen a cyber attack, result, quite in that. So, I mean, I think a lot of what we see as or get interpreted as cyber attacks are really intelligence operations, collecting information on whatever the target may be. And sometimes it's not U.S. government. I mean, the Chinese have stolen an enormous amount of intellectual property from, a variety of industries. Is that cyber warfare? I don't think so, really. It's intelligence operations, but in a very different context than we would use our intelligence tools. The Vol Typhoon pre-positioning tools, is that an act of warfare? Yes, theoretically, but it's really preparing for potential warfare. So I mean, we are in a very, active period of doing reconnaissance against our adversaries in cyberspace to understand what the threat is. But we're not in a period of active warfare. Now, on the military side, Cyber Command has a mandate to continuously look at these various networks in case of wartime against a whole variety of adversaries. That's not necessarily just the Chinese, Russians, Iranians, and North Koreans. But again, I would argue that's akin to, driving an aircraft carrier, like, off the coast of an adversary nation. They know you're there. They know you're, and in the cyber context, they know you're in the networks. And it does act as a deterrent in some ways. It's not a very public deterrent like an aircraft carrier, but it is in a lot of ways a similar sort of thought process.
So that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about next. So,
Right.
Are we currently in a state where we're able to use, the threat of cyber warfare or, offensive cyber operations as a deterrent? And in your mind, is that an effective strategy that we should be pursuing?
We're not yet there, but that conversation is happening. And the conversation also, happened during previous attacks, be it, or sorry, I'm using the wrong language because it wasn't an attack. The SolarWinds incident, which was an intelligence collection operation, or the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline, where, our gasoline distribution got shut down on the Eastern Seaboard several years ago. So there was a lot of discussions on how you respond to that. You don't necessarily need to respond to a cyber incident with cyber tools. You can use diplomatic tools. You can use sanctions. You can shut down embassies or consulates, eject, foreign adversary diplomats, whatever the case may be. But as far as a true cyber deterrence, we're still having that conversation yet, and haven't, coalesced around what that looks like. But for example, the Iranians attacked water treatment facility IoT devices that were made in Israel but used in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Texas, I believe, last year. They attacked these as sort of a demonstration of their approbum against us for having an Israeli company, manage our water treatment. I believe a deterrent step on that is that if an attack like that happens again, we should have a reciprocal. Again, I'm not in a policy position, but this would be my recommendation, is to have a reciprocal attack to say, we know you did this. Now we're going to do something to your water treatment plant. That doesn't result in death and destruction, but it is a point which I think in the aggregate will be a deterrent, will have a deterrent effect against the Iranians or whatever other actor it is. And I'll cite, since we're talking about Iran, I will cite what the Iranians have used their cyber tools for in the past in what I would call coercive diplomacy. It's not warfare. It's something other than warfare, but the Albanians were hosting the Mujahideen al-Halq, which was an Iranian opposition organization. And the Iranians didn't like that. And they put pressure on the Albanians to eject the Mujahideen al-Halq from their safe haven there in Albania, and the Albanians were, not listening. So the Iranians shut down the Albanian government networks. I mean, really destroyed the networks and did not try to hide it. It had the intended effect. The Albanians started rethinking whether they were going to host the Mujahideen al-Halq. So, I mean, countries do use their cyber tools to achieve diplomatic or defensive ends. We just have not really done that yet, and for a variety of policy and legal reasons. But I think we're moving the policy in a direction where we're going to have those offensive tools at the ready, and more so than we have in the past.
I love the analogy of the aircraft carrier and being able to just have kind of I don't know if you can call, I've never called an aircraft carrier subtle before, but like a subtle display of strength and deterrence there. Or even, I think more recently of like surfacing a nuclear sub, right? Like just being able to show like, hey, we're here, we have the capability.
And the Navy has done that for years. I mean, that's why, Navy ships around the world make port calls. It's in part so that the sailors can get off and relax a little bit. But the real reason is a show of force, saying we're here. You make reference to submarines. We're here. We're, one country away from whatever adversary it might be. And so it does send a message. I mean, it's harder to do that in cyberspace, but, we have cyber part both on the military side and across the U.S. government. We have cyber relationships, defensive and offensive cyber relationships across the globe. And our adversaries are aware of that. And that sends a message as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned Iran, and it came up in a few different contexts there. When I think of, offensive cyber operations, still, the number one that comes to my mind, ever is probably Stuxnet. And I'm curious, I mean, first of all, and for listeners or viewers who aren't familiar with Stuxnet, it was, if I can call it a virus, it was malicious code that was injected into Iranian nuclear, refineries or plants that like really set back their nuclear program. And so, I mean, a couple of questions for you, Andy. First of all, is Stuxnet in your mind still the greatest, like the most impactful example of cyber offensive operations? And second of all, do you expect us to see another from not just from the U.S. or Israel or whoever, globally? Do you expect to see another Stuxnet sized moment in the next 5 years?
So, I will neither confirm nor deny my own knowledge of that outside of a fantastic book by a good friend of mine, Kim Zetter. There's a book called Countdown to Zero Day, which is the most detailed account of the Stuxnet event. And what I would say it differentiates, what Kim talks about in that book is the very specific, using process PLCs, process logic controllers, and a very targeted thing to achieve a specific policy goal.
Right.
And that goes back to my speed, intensity, and control. You can do it fast, you can do it intense, you can do it controlled, but all those variables have to be in sync. And I would argue, and again, the way that Kim Zetter outlines it in her book, that all those variables were in synchronicity, and that's a very, very rare thing. So are we going to see more of those in the future? Yeah, maybe. I mean, if a nation state, the United States or others, is trying to achieve a very specific goal in an operation short of war, maybe. But again, I'll go back to February 2022 and the Russians. I mean, we expected, Stuxnet like cyber attacks from the Russians against the Ukrainians, against NATO, our NATO partners, against us if we supported the Ukrainians. And for the most part, that did not happen. I mean, there was one the day before the Russians invaded Ukraine. There was one attack against the satellite communications network that was fairly effective. That indicated to us that they had pre-planned that and thought that one out. But if you as a government, in this case, the Russians, didn't very specifically plan out like one would plan, the invasion, and they didn't do a very good job of planning their invasion, you're not going to have effective cyber attacks either. So again, to the whole point, like, can people just push a button? No, it has to be very well thought out and have a very specific objective. Something I would think in the next 5 years in the international arena will, trigger the need for some nation state to do that. But it's not going to be like in the movies where like the power goes out, from Los Angeles to New York. It just doesn't work that way. It would have to be very specific. They want to take down X, or they want to have Y effect on a particular network. And then, if that happens, I hope, Kim Zetter writes another book, so that I can reference that by, my own knowledge of it.
Right. I do want to come back to the Russian piece, though. And you described it earlier as like the cyber warfare component of the Ukraine invasion as a nothing burger. And in some ways, at least from what I've read varying things from either, yes, it was truly a nothing burger, to, wow, there was actually more than we're hearing about publicly. And, there were some operations there. But as far as I can tell, we were almost caught off guard by how absent the cyber warfare element was from that invasion. And I'm curious if you have any insider speculation as to why.
So the why is multifaceted. I mean, I do think the Ukrainians beefed up their defenses after NotPetya and various other cyber attacks, starting, when the Russians invaded or occupied Crimea back in 2014 on through 2017 and then up until 2022. They built out their own government cyber defenses very, in a very robust manner. They also partnered with Western cyber defense companies. They partnered with Microsoft and a whole variety of other foreign entities. I mean, all of that, quadrupled after the invasion, but they had already built up those relationships. So that's one. I mean, the defenders had a vote. Two goes back to my other point where, you had that highway going up towards Belarus into Ukraine, where tanks, Russian trucks were all like stuck because they didn't think through the logistics and the fuel necessary for that invasion. There's a corollary on the cyber side. They didn't plan particularly well on the cyber attacks. They didn't really inform the leadership of the cyber entities to the degree that they needed to. So, you need very, detailed planning to have effective cyber attacks. So I think that's the second variable that made it what we thought were going to be more intense attacks just never happened. And then the third is, the Russian, Vladimir Putin's perception that if he escalated cyber attacks against NATO or just the United States or NATO writ large, that may have been an escalatory event that triggered something that the Russians didn't want to deal with. I mean, in their mind, the Ukrainian invasion was going to be a short-lived thing. It wasn't. And they didn't want to escalate. And I do think, and maybe correctly, Putin continues to fear that escalation, despite the fact that we crossed almost every red line that we'd predicted, providing weapons to the Ukrainians, cutting off the Russians from the banking system, the SWIFT system, and whatnot. And they still didn't retaliate for that. And then the fourth variable actually is, I mean, if the Russians destroyed all the Ukrainian networks en route to their invasion, um, they would have no networks to use when they got to Kyiv. I mean, they thought it would be a short-lived invasion. They would occupy, they would take over the country, and they were going to need those networks. And so once it was clear that wasn't going to happen, you would have thought they would have conducted cyber attacks against the networks in Kyiv or the electric grids. But instead, what they did is they used, artillery and missiles and rockets and whatnot. In my mind, if they actually had the tools to attack the electric grid in Ukraine, they would have, because a cyber attack is certainly cheaper than sending ballistic missiles against the electric grid. So I think, all four of those variables are relevant. And I think that will inform how we assess nation state threats going forward. But we shouldn't, overlearn those lessons, because China is a very different place than Russia.
Yeah. So as we think about threat vectors going forward, I think lots has been said about this, and I don't want to necessarily rehash it. But in your mind, are there any kind of underreported or undercovered threat vectors that you think should get more airtime or should be higher on people's minds?
I mean, not necessarily, although, we focus in this industry a lot on things that we discovered. We talk a lot about, the telecommunications industry because of the Seoul Typhoon attack. What I worry about is the thing that we haven't discovered yet. So as soon as we identify a threat, we should start pivoting off to, okay, what are we missing? We discovered Volt Typhoon and penetrations of critical infrastructure in that context, but what are we missing? And so I think it has to be a constantly refreshing discussion on the threat vectors. There's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns. That, to use a phrase that former Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld used to use, it's the unknown unknowns that concern me deeply within the critical infrastructure sector, and it just takes a lot of creative thinking from cyber defenders to think those through and to have a public dialogue about it. The only thing that we should do behind closed doors in the U.S. government is if we have intelligence that we can't, discuss publicly due to sources and methods. But otherwise, we should have a very public discussion on these threats, because, there's plenty of industries out there that are not going to have access to the U.S. government on a direct basis, and they need to be part of the dialogue.
So what's your best advice for CISOs and for boards, across the private sector on, your best advice for how they keep themselves safe and contribute to keeping, the nation safe?
So for boards or, chairmen or CEOs, and people in this industry will recognize this point, but stop treating your CISOs like they're basement dwellers and they don't belong at the board meeting, or they don't belong in the C-suite. If you're serious about cybersecurity, then treat your CSO and your CISO like part of the leadership team. For years, CISOs have been treated like, oh yeah, we got to hire a CISO, but we don't really want to see him, and just sort of lock him in the basement and that'll be fine. Because what, policy and legislation, it's in some ways it's already there, but it more is coming. If you don't, as a CEO or a board member, understand the threat vector and have a routine conversation with your CISO, with your CSO, you're going to be liable for cyber attacks, against your customers' data or whatnot. So that's the advice for the boards and other leadership entities at various corporations. For the CISOs, I could recommend, go on for an hour about various tools, various threat vectors to worry about. But I think the best strategic advice I would offer to any CISO is just as it's incumbent on the board to understand the CISO has to understand the board. And you can't be, crying wolf every time there's a threat vector, because your job is to prevent those threat vectors. And you have to understand, and a lot of folks in the cybersecurity industry are very, channeled down that cybersecurity realm. You have to understand what is important to your CEO, what's important to your CFO, what's important to the board, and what matters from a product development perspective, what matters from a revenue perspective, and frame everything that you do as a CISO or a CSO into how you're contributing to the mission of that company, whatever the product is, be it a software company or a toy manufacturer, whatever the case may be. Because for years, again, CISOs were locked in the basement by the CEO, but they kind of liked it. They kind of liked being in their own world. CISOs cannot just sequester themselves in their own world. They have to be part of the dialogue, and they have to have reasonable requests for investments in security. How explain to the CEO and the board how an investment in $1 million in attack surface management tools or network defense tools, why it matters, and what the cost will be if they don't invest that. And that's hard. A lot of IT security professionals don't necessarily know how to have that dialogue with the senior leadership in their companies, but they have to learn.
Well said. It makes sense, and I think that's extremely powerful advice for both sides there. Andy, I did want to ask you, dangerous question. What's your craziest cyber career story that you can share today?
I don't know if it's crazy. It's just it was a wake up call for me on the importance of cyber as it relates to the intelligence community, but how it relates to national security writ large. It again goes back to February 2022. I received a call from the director of CIA, Bill Burns, at the time, that I needed to participate with him in White House level meetings, with cabinet level meetings, not as a cabinet member, but as a backbencher supporting him. And I was like, that's weird. I'm not the guy in charge of, that thing in Europe. But it was because of the potential for cyber threats that were out there that I participated in those conversations. And that was a wake up call to me where, I was very cognizant of our capabilities in cyberspace and whatnot. But it was a wake up call to me like, oh, wow, we're now cyber warriors, so to speak, are now at the front table. And frankly, it's a corollary to what we just discussed about CISOs. Like I didn't sequester myself in the basement as director of CCI, but I didn't necessarily think I was going to be at that table for that particular discussion. But cyber defense and cyber strategic analysis is infused in everything now. So I shouldn't have been surprised, but that was a very surprising moment in my tenure as a cyber leader.
Well, it's amazing, and it speaks. On the one hand, I'm glad that that's starting to get that recognition, but it speaks to the importance of it, and it kind of acts as a beacon, I would hope, to some of the organizations that are maybe resisting that position and want to keep CISOs in the basement. So
right,
awesome. Hey, Andy, this has been a super, super interesting discussion. I wanted to say a big thanks for joining today. So we covered a lot of ground, and I really appreciate your insights.
Thank you, Jeff. I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed our conversation.